In this video, we're going to look at Django Filter, which is a reusable third-party Django package, and it can help you when it comes to filtering your query sets based on parameters you get in a GET request from forms. We're going to see what that means later on, but the crux of Django Filter is it allows you to filter down a query set based on a model's fields. So let's get started. In VS Code, I have a Django project already set up. We've got a base template here that loads up Bootstrap, and we're going to use that for some basic styling throughout this video. We have an index.html template that extends this base template, and other than that, we have a single URL in this application that maps to this single view that we have. We're going to build on that throughout this video, and we're going to use Django Filter to filter down a base query set. Now to start with, we need some models to work with. So let's go to models.py, and we're going to define a book model here. So let's write a class called book here, and I'm going to paste some basic fields. We're going to extend these with a couple of extra fields, but for now, let's look at the name field. That's a car field, and that represents the name of the book. We also have a price field, and because this is a basic demo, we just make that a float field rather than a decimal field. And we also have a number in stock. That's a positive integer field. Obviously it's positive because we can't have a negative number in stock. Now what we're going to do now is we're going to define a genre for this book, and that's going to be another car field here. And for this car field, we're going to define some choices, and we're going to do that through a Django text choices class. And in Django 4, this is the best practice for defining choices. We define a class, and this one we're going to call genre choices, and it's going to inherit from the models.text choices class. And this is kind of similar to an enum. You create fields on this class that define the values that the choices can take. So I'm going to paste the choices that we can use here. We have crime, non-fiction, sci-fi, and an other choice. And now we need to tell this car field that these are our choices. So we refer to the genre choices.choices attribute. And because it's a car field, we're going to give it a max length, and we're going to say 1 for this. And that's because these have a single character that should be represented in the database. The value of these fields in the text choices class, such as N for non-fiction, that's what's actually stored in the database. And each of these have a length of 1, so we're going to say max length of 1 for that choice field. And finally, we're going to define an author here, and that's going to be a models.foreign key, and it's going to be a foreign key to an author table that we're going to create in a second. And when we delete that author, we want to cascade that and delete the associated books. So on delete, models.cascade. Now let's create this class called author, and this is going to inherit from models.model. We're going to keep this simple, and the author has a name field, and that's all we need for this. So what we're going to do now is activate a virtual environment and run the migrations. Now I'm on a Mac, so I'm going to use the source command, and I'm going to refer to a virtual environment that I've already created, and it's the venv bin activate command. Once you've activated your environment with Django installed, we can run the make migrations management command. And once you've activated that virtual environment, you can run the python manage.py make migrations command. As you can see, that creates the migration file for the author and the book table. And then we can finally run migrate to actually create that database. So now we have a database that contains these two tables along with the Django default tables. What we're now going to do is add a Django form that's going to allow us to filter down the books that we have in the database by the name of the book. So let's go to forms.py, and I'm going to define a class here called bookNameFilterForm, and that inherits from Django's form class. And because we're filtering by the name of the book, let's make this a forms.car field. So in other words, let's say we have a list of 10 books in the database. This name field is a text input, and if the user types a particular name, let's say they type the word crime, we want that to filter down the list of books so that it only returns books with crime in the title, for example, Crime and Punishment. So the next step here is to add this new form to our context. So I'm going to copy the name of the form and go to the views.py file. And from the core.forms module, we're going to import the name of that form. And then we're going to add it here to our context with a key of form. And we instantiate that. And in addition to that, from the core.models, we're going to import the book model. And we're also going to add a key to our context called books. And this is going to be equal to book.objects.all. So we're going to get all books in the database. So that's our context. Let's now go to the index.html template. And in there, we're going to render the form and also the list of books that we have in the database. So let's go to index.html. Let's remove the hello. And at the top of this file, I'm going to paste some HTML. This is a form element and it has a method of get, so we're going to send a get request to the backend when this form is submitted. And the URL that that get request is going to go to is this one here. It's the index URL which we already have here. It's the one we've just defined that context in. We then render the form as paragraph tags, and underneath that we have a submit button. So this is the form that we'll use to filter down the books that we have in our list, but we actually need to render that list as well in this template. So let's do a divider here, an HR tag, and underneath that we're going to list out the books in an HTML table. So we have here a table, it's got the fields that we want to render out, and to actually render the values we're iterating over the books that we have in our context, and we're outputting the data such as the name of the book, and we're following foreign keys here to the author's name, and we're using this get genre display function. And the reason for that, if we go back to models.py, remember in the database the genre is represented by a single character. N, for example, stands for non-fiction. So when we display the genre, we don't want to just put the letter N, we want to actually put non-fiction. So these choice fields such as genre, they have a function called get genre display, and that will give you the human readable name for the choice. And if you have other choice fields instead of genre, you can substitute that in the name of the function. For example, if you had a choice field called school, it would be get school display. So that's all the code we need for the template at the moment. Let's run the Django server and we're going to go to this page, and this is how it looks at the moment. We have this form at the top and we have a book list containing no books. We need to now add books to the database. Now you can do this in multiple ways. You can add them via the Django admin, but what I'm going to do is define a management command within the core application. So we have a management folder, and in that management folder we have another folder called commands, and that's following the Django structure for defining custom management commands. Within the commands folder we have a command called createbooks.py, and what this is going to do is add some authors and some books to the database. Now I've already got this code pre-populated, and I'm adding some authors at the top, and then underneath that we add some books. If you're following along with this tutorial, feel free to add these via the Django admin, or you can create your own version of this script. All you need to do is create an author with a given name, and then you can create book objects and associate them with the author that you've created above. So let's stop the server and we're going to run this custom script. It's called createbooks.py, so we're going to run python manage.py create books. Hopefully that's going to populate our database. So let's run the server again and go back to the page. If we refresh this page, we now have a table containing some books, and each of the books has an author, a genre and a price. Let's just assume that we're selling these books in a store. So the goal now is to submit this form, and based on what the user writes in this field, we want to filter down the book list to a given subset of the books. Now we have a book called Fahrenheit 451. So for example, if I was to type Fahrenheit into this field and submit that, we want to then filter down the table to just contain that particular book, Fahrenheit 451. Now at the moment, if we submit this, nothing happens. We still have the same table. You can see, however, in the URL, we have now a get parameter called name equals Fahrenheit. So that syntax there, we have a key of name, and that corresponds to the name that we've defined here in the form. It's called name, so in the get request, the key name is also name. And the value, if you look at the URL, is just what we've typed in. Now what we want to do, in the view, we want to filter down the books based on what's been submitted here. So what we're going to do is go to the views.py file, and what we can do here is get the name from the submitted get request, and we can do that by using the request.get object. That's essentially a Python dictionary, which we can then call .get on, and we pass the name of the key that we want to get from the URL. In this case it's name. So if the user has submitted that form with a particular value, it's going to be accessible to us on the back end here in this name variable. Now that we've done that, we're going to set up a books object, and that's book.objects.all. So that gives us all books in the database, and then what we can say is if the name is not none, we can then filter down that books by saying books is equal to books.filter, and the condition is the name of the book should contain, and we use I-contains for a case insensitive match. It should contain whatever has been submitted by the user. And finally, we have now the books in a variable. We can adjust what we're putting in the context here and reference those books. So just to reiterate what's going on here, we get the name from the get request if it exists. We then fetch all of the books from the database, that's the base query set. If we have a name being submitted to the server, we then filter down all of the books to only those whose name contains what's been submitted in that form. So let's try this again. If we go back to the front end and we try submitting this form with Fahrenheit, when we actually submit, we now get back a filtered table containing only that book. And if we type 19 in here, we should expect only to get 1984, and we do. So now this is working and the code is fairly easy. We simply have a filter statement based on whether or not we've submitted a GET request. So that works fine, but imagine that we wanted to filter based on multiple fields. So we have a name, we have an author, and a genre and a price. The logic will get very complicated if we're trying to filter on multiple fields based on different conditions. For example, we might want to get all books between $10 and $20, as well as all sci-fi books between those prices. If you have these complex situations where users can submit multiple values and that can filter based on multiple fields, you might want to consider using Django Filter, and that's what we're going to do now. And the benefit of using Django Filter is we don't need to have these large views which contain lots of conditional checks. Instead, we extract the logic to something called a FilterSet, and that's what we're going to do now. So let's stop the server and we're going to run the pip install Django-filter command, and that will install that in our environment. Once that's installed, let's go to settings.py and we're going to add Django filters to our installed apps. Once we've done that, we're going to then create within our core application a new file here, and it's going to be called filters.py, and that's the standard name for Django filters. If you define a file, typically it's called filters.py. Now let's go to the documentation for a second. This is Django filters documentation. There's a getting started, which I'll link below the video, and there's a section here for the filter. This is the FilterSet class that we're going to define. For this one, it's a product filter, and as you can see, it's got a field called name. And that's an instance of a Django Filters car filter. And that defines a lookup expression, in this case, 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗀𝗲𝗲. Underneath that, we have a meta class, and that links to a particular model, in this case, the product model, and it has some fields on that model, the price field and the release date field. So as well as these two fields, there's a custom field called name as well. And you can see that this syntax is very similar to Django's model forms. We define a meta class and we have a model and fields. So we're going to define our own filter set now. If we go back to filters.py, I'm going to bring a couple of imports in here. First of all, we're importing Django filters, and we're also importing the book model. Now underneath that, we're going to define a class called book filter, and that's going to inherit from Django filters.filterset. And underneath that, we're going to define a meta class containing the book model as its model, and we have the four fields: name, the author's name, the price, and the genre. Those are the fields that we're going to allow users to filter by when they submit these GET requests with the form. So for example, now instead of just being able to filter by the name of the book, we're also going to include these other three fields and let users filter by these fields. So that's our filter set. Let's go back to views.py. We're going to import that at the top, and then up here we can remove all these lines of code, and our filter set is going to take care of this for us. So what we're going to do is define a book filter, and that's going to be equal to an instance of this book filter class, and to that we pass the data from the GET request with the request.get property. And we also need a base query set. In this case, it's going to be book.objects.all. So when we submit a filter, it's going to look over all the books in the database to filter that down to a subset of those books. And once it's done the filtering based on the GET parameters, we can then reference the book filter.QuerySet, and that's the .qs property. That contains the filtered query set based on the GET parameters. So let's save that and start the Django server again, and we can go back to our page here. Now if we search here, let's say for Fahrenheit 451, this is no longer going to work. What we need to do is actually use the form that the filter set gives us. Now the filter set class, when you instantiate it, it contains a form with all of the fields that we've defined here in this fields meta attribute. So what we're going to do is go back to views.py, and instead of instantiating this book name filter form, we're going to reference the bookFilter.form attribute, and we can now remove the import of that form that we created earlier. So let's save this and go back to the page now, and you can see we now have a different form, and this form contains 4 fields, one for each of the fields we defined in the Django filter. And now if we filter by genre, let's say we wanted all crime books, that's now going to do that automatically. It's going to filter down to just the crime books in the database. And similarly, if we go to sci-fi, it's going to filter to the sci-fi books. Now one issue we've got here, let's go back to all books. By default, the lookup is an exact lookup. So if we wanted to filter the book list down by the name of the book, we would need to specify the exact name of the book. For example, Fahrenheit 451. If we paste that into the name field, we get that book. But if we remove 1 from the title, this is no longer going to work because it's not an exact match. As you can see, we don't get any results. Now this is not desirable behavior at all. We want to be able to perform for this string field representing the book's name. We want to be able to perform an 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗁𝗲𝗲, a case-insensitive lookup to check whether the book contains what the user has typed in. And that should be the same for the author's name. So let's go back to our book filter class in filters.py. And it turns out we can customize these fields, or rather we can customize the lookup expression that occurs for each of them. So rather than a list, we're now going to define a Python dictionary instead. And each of these fields is going to be a key in that dictionary that maps to a list of lookup expressions. For the name field, we want the lookup expression to be 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗁𝗲𝗲. So we specify that in a string within that list. Now for the author's name, we also want to specify an 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗁𝗲 lookup for that one. And let's separate these into new lines. Now for the price field, we don't want to do an exact lookup or a contains lookup for that. We want to do a less than or greater than lookup. So we might want to check and find all books that are less than $20, for example. We specify the LT lookup to do that. Now for the genre, we want an exact lookup, and that's because we have here in the front end a drop down containing the exact value that's mapped to the database. So it's fine to go with an exact lookup for the genre, and in fact that's why this worked earlier. As you can see again here, when we filtered down to just the crime books. Remember, it's exact by default, so that worked earlier on. So let's go back to our filter class, make sure you save that, and we can now go back to our page, and you should notice we now have 5 fields in this form. And that's because the price field contained 2 lookup expressions, so it split that out into 2 different form fields. One for the price being less than a number, and one for the price being greater than a number. So now we can do filtering such as we want to find all crime books where the price is less than $20 but it's greater than $10, and if we submit that, we now get 2 crime books within that range of prices. And we can now search for the author's name. It's a case insensitive contains, so if I type Orwell and we submit that, we get the books by George Orwell in the database. And the FilterSet class is going to take care of the logic for filtering down the query set based on what we've submitted. And you can see in the URL, it builds up the get parameters based on what we've submitted on the front end. And the values in the get request are then received here in the view. They're passed to the book filter, which then takes care of the logic of filtering down the query set. And importantly, you can reference the filtered query set with the bookfilter.qs attribute, and you can also access a form with the bookfilter.form attribute, and that will generate a form based on what you have in your meta class. And we can change the lookups. For example, we might want the book to start with a particular set of characters, so we can use the 𝑖StartsWith lookup for that. If we go back to the front end again, if we look for all books that start with ST, we now get Strangers on a Train. It's now looking at the start of the string and it's filtering based on that. Now for the price field, we can also use something called a range filter. Let's see how to do that now on the filter set. We can take the price out of the fields dictionary here, and then we can define a field manually at the top called price. And this is going to be a Django filters.rangeFilter. If we save that and go back to the front end, we're going to see how this changes the form. We now have a range filter which generates this field here. It contains price, and you can see it's a range. It's from one value to another. So for example, we wanted to fetch all books between $10 and $20. We can submit this here and we get back all the books in that range. And we can further filter that down to just sci-fi books, for example, by specifying the sci-fi filter. So that's how you use a range filter, and we've defined that explicitly as a field on the class rather than defining it in the meta class. Now we've got 2 more things to cover in this video. First of all, let's see how to do this with a class-based list view. And secondly, we're going to go over integration with Django REST Framework. So let's go to views.py and we're going to define a Django class-based view here. It's going to be a list view. So we're going to import from django.views.generic.list the list view class. Below the functional view, we're going to define a book list view that inherits from the list view. And one of the required fields for a list view is a query set. So let's say book.objects.all. We also need to reference a template. So let's say template name is equal to index.html. It's the same template that we rendered in the functional view. And finally, we're going to say context object name equals books. We're going to see what that means in a second. Now what we're going to start by doing is defining a function or a method called getQuerySet within this class. This defines the returned query set that we're going to render in the list view. So what we do firstly here is we call the super book.getQuerySet function. That returns to us this query set of books here. Secondly, what we're going to do is define self.FilterSet, and we want to set that equal to an instance of our book filter, and again we pass self.request.get to that filter. That's the get parameters. This time, because it's a class-based view, it's self.request, and remember that also requires a query set, which we're going to set to the query set we got in the line above here. So that's us instantiated the filter set. What we're now going to do is return the self.filterset.qs attribute. That's the query set we have after filtering based on the get parameters. So in the end, this is the same as we had above, bookFilter.qs. We're just writing it in a class-based view, and we're overriding the getQuerySet function to do that. So that's the query set of book objects that's going to be in our template, and we're giving it a context object name of books. And that just tells the class-based view what we want to actually call the query set in the template. And remember, we have an index template and we're iterating over books here. It's called books in the functional view, so we're going to call it that here in this list view, this class-based view as well. Now, one other thing we need to do is define a function called getContextData here, and that takes self and quargs as arguments. We instantiate the context by calling the superclasses getContextData method, and what we need to add to the context that's not specified by default is the form. In the functional view, we reference the form here with the bookFilter.form attribute. In this case, what we're going to do is refer to the self.FilterSet, and that's the filter set that we saved to the view instance here on line 22 in the getQuerySet method. So that's now available in getContextData, and that's because the getContextData function, that's called later in the chain than the getQuerySet function. And you can see this chain in the generic display views documentation. If you scroll down to the list view, the method flowchart here, it calls getQuerySet before getContextData. So what we're going to do is set the form to self.filterset.form, and then we can return the context. And that's all we need to write for the class-based view. Now, I would argue that the functional view is quite a bit simpler in this case. We don't need to override methods, but there are use cases where you'd be using a class-based view and you want to understand how to use a filter. So that's just a demonstration of how we can use getQuerySet and getContextData in order to do that. The final thing we need to do is go to urls.py, and we're going to change the view that's mapped to here. It's going to be book list view, and because it's a class-based view, we need to call the asView method. So let's go back to our page. We have the books here. Let's now see if this is working. If we try and filter down to the sci-fi books, we can see it's still working. Now it's using the class-based view in order to do the filtering. Now, in the last part of this post, I want to use Django REST Framework, and we're going to create a very simple API for our book list. So first of all, let's stop the server and we're going to run pip install Django REST Framework. We can then go to our settings.py and add REST Framework to our installed apps. Now what we want to do is serialize a list of books from the database. What we're going to do here is define a new file in the core application called serializers.py. At the top of that, from REST Framework, we're going to import the serializers module, and then we're going to define a class called book serializer that inherits from the model serializer. This is similar to model forms, and it's similar to the filter set we defined earlier. It has a meta class, and that meta class is linked to a model, which in this case is going to be book, and we'll import the book model at the top here. Finally, we're going to define fields here, and the fields are going to be the same as we had earlier. We're going to have the name of the book, we're going to have the author's name, and we're going to define that in a custom manner in a second. Let's for now call it author_name. We're going to define the price and the genre. Now, if we look at the book model, there is no attribute or no field called author name. We have a foreign key called author, so we're going to reference that in our serializer. We're going to create a custom field that will match what we've put in our fields. It's going to be called author name, and that's going to be equal to a serializers.char field. And the char field can take a keyword argument called source, and this is a string that represents where this value should come from. So it's going to be the author foreign key. We follow the foreign key and we get the name of the author. So that's our serializer. That's going to take a list of books from the database and it's going to convert that into JSON data for our API response. What we now need to do is go to the views.py file, and at the bottom we're going to define another class-based view. It's going to be an API list view. So let's go to the top of views.py, and at the top I'm going to throw in another couple of imports. The book serializer that we've just created, and from REST Framework's generics module we're going to import the list API view. So let's scroll to the bottom and we're going to define a class here called book list API view. This inherits from REST Framework's list API view. It takes a query set that we want to use as a base query set here, and it's book.objects.all. And importantly, the list API view, it also takes a serializer class, and that's going to be the book serializer that we just created in the serializers.py file. And that's actually all we need here to return the list of books. Very simple to make APIs in Django with Django REST Framework. Let's now go to our urls.py and we're going to add a new URL for this API view. It's going to be the API endpoint and it refers to the book list API view. So let's start the Django server here and we're going to go back to our page and we're going to load this API endpoint. And we get back a list of these objects, these book objects. So if we had a front-end React application, for example, that could then accept this JSON data and store that in its own state. And that's the purpose of these APIs. They allow different applications to talk to one another and exchange data. So I'm going to go to the documentation for REST Framework. It includes a section on Django Filter. And it turns out that Django Filter and Django REST Framework are very easily integrated. To use the filter in an API view, there are two choices, and you can see these here. You either add the filter backend to your settings. So REST Framework settings has a setting called default filter backends that you can refer to the Django filter backend. Or alternatively, you can add the filter backend to individual views or view sets. Now we're going to go with the second approach here, and we're going to configure the filter set directly on our API view class. So let's go back to views.py, and at the top we're going to bring in another import. This is the last import. It's going to be from Django Filter's REST Framework module. We have the Django Filter backend. So Django Filters itself has a module for REST Framework, and it defines this backend for use with Django REST Framework. So let's go down to the bottom, and for our book list API view, we're going to add a couple of new fields here, and I'm going to paste these in here. First of all, we have the filter backends. We set that to the Django filter backend that we've just imported, and the FilterSet class, that's the important one here. We set that to the book filter that we've been working with throughout this video. So let's save that and go back to our API here. If we refresh the page, we now see we have the same data coming back, but we have this option here for filters. If we click that, we get this rather ugly looking form. But let's say we wanted to filter down to authors containing Orwell. If we submit that, we can see that it now returns the JSON data only for those authors whose surname contains Orwell. And again, if we go back to the filters, let's say we wanted all sci-fi books. If we select that, we now get the sci-fi books from our database returned by our API. So that's all working. One thing to note is that the genre is now referring to what's in the database, that single character value. If we wanted to get the human readable name, we can go back to our serializer here and we can manually define that here. So the genre is going to be a serializers.char field, and the source this time is going to be the get genre display method, and that's the method we talked about earlier that returns the human readable name for a choice field. If we save that and go back to our API and refresh here, we now get the human readable name for the genre of the book. So we can see how easily Django Filter integrates with Django REST Framework. So when you're creating APIs for React or Vue applications, or even for mobile applications, you can use Django Filter very easily to allow users to filter data in a very versatile manner. And we can change easily the default query set that is used by these filters. For example, if I go back to views.py, for our list view, we're defining all of the books, but what we could do instead is we could filter those down to a subset rather than all the rows. For example, our book model had a field called number in stock. We might only want to return the book list where the number in stock is greater than 0. So that excludes anything that's out of stock. So you can customize the default query set on a list view, and you can also customize the query set that's passed to the Django filter set in the first place. So you could specify that same filter operation here when you're instantiating the book filter. So that's all for this video. We've learned how to use Django Filter in order to filter down query sets based on complicated get parameters from a form. We've learned how to use our filters and define specific lookup expressions for each field. And we've learned how to work with these filters within a function-based view and a class-based view. Finally, we've also learned how to work with Django REST Framework and the integration that it has with Django Filters. And we're using that here at the bottom to define a FilterSet class on our list API view that allows us to easily filter the API response. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to the channel. We'll see you in the next video.